Hi guys, and welcome to elections in the UK. We're going to start at first past the post. Now, this presentation is deliberately capped at 15 minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to go on indefinitely. So it's really, really important that when we're going through this presentation, you have to hand both your hard copy of this presentation and also a hard copy of all of that electoral data that you collated in class. That's going to make this an awful lot more entertaining and indeed useful. Because what we're going to do is we're going to go from how we get from here, that is the ballot box, to this, which even now you should be able to recognise as our glorious Houses of Parliament. Before we do that, let's have a look at some initial conditions. Well, there we are, that's the UK, and it's all covered in squiggly lines and they're different colours. Well, there are, give or take, 60 million people in the UK, and what they do is they divide that, they divide that into 650 constituencies. So each of these little units that you can see here is what we call a constituency. So there's 650 of those. Now, there are about 47 million voters in the UK, and obviously they're scattered across those constituencies, but they divide the constituencies such that there's about 70,000 voters in each of those constituencies. And obviously we can see here, this is the biggest one up here, Argyll and Bute and Loch Arbor, I think, and the smallest one is in here, and it's Islington North, but you should have worked that out earlier. Anyway, so we've got about 70,000 voters in each of those. In England, there are 533 constituencies. There are Scotland, 59 and 14. You can read that, actually. You've probably been able to work that out. And of course, you'll have noticed from the research we were doing in class that that number varies over time. It's constantly being topped and tailed. And obviously, this was the table that you did in class, so that will come in handy. Keep that out. So, here we are. We're in Buckingham, and Buckingham is weird. You'll notice, there we are, that Buckingham isn't a colour, and that's because our MP is Burko. Yeah, that map was a bit out of date. That obviously is 2010, and here we are in 2015. Very, very different patterns over this, of course, big solid mass of yellow here representing the triumph of the SNP, whereas over here there were lots of Lib Dems. Yes, and this is all SNP, and slightly different shape over there. But we'll talk all about that in class. In fact, the more I look at that, the more fascinating it's going to be. So questions, write them, and we'll address them in class. Anyway, we are pushing on. So, stage one, the constituency vote. Now, this is a ballot paper from 2010, and it's actually from my old London manor, which was Deptford. We got there Joan Ruddock. She was the Labour MP for Deptford for a long, long time. She's since stood down, as we'll see in a second. Anyway, so that's your ballot paper. And in the first past the post system, which is the system we deploy what I call the rule of one. And it works like this. Well, it's one man, one vote, or one woman, one vote. Yeah, we sort of sorted that out in about 1929. One candidate per party. Here you can see each of the parties represented. There's the Greens, there's Lib Dems, Each of them has got just one candidate, so one candidate per party. And you'll also notice that the punter has got one vote. One vote, and there's one count and there's one winner. Now, all of that may sound incredibly obvious, but trust me, when we come to look at alternative systems, this will look simple in the extreme. So, one man, one vote, one candidate per party, one overall count, and one winner. And there are systems that play merry hell with all of those, and we'll look at those over the next few weeks. Won't be able to get into them in this particular presentation. So, here we are. I mentioned Buckingham and I mentioned Deptford. Now, Buckingham, we've got the Speaker, and you'll notice, significant by absence there, we've got no Conservatives, no Labour, no Lib Dems, etc., etc., etc. That is because he is the Speaker, and by convention, the big parties don't run against the Speaker. So that's a pretty useless example that we've got there. But hey, let's look at Lewisham and Deptford, and this is a much more typical constituency. Well, once upon a time it was much more typical. Now it's extremely atypical because look at that. Labour actually was able to increase its majority. Now, there are all sorts of interesting things going on here. For example, here he got a whopping great majority, only 36% there voted against him. Here, 40% voted against the actual winner, which makes both of these particularly atypical. Normally, or rather, it's very, very unusual for a party to, or for an MP to return with such a whopping great majority. But what we can say is that all of these votes here And all of these votes here essentially counted for nothing. Your vote went to no one. And all the people who voted for Francis and all the people who voted for Dave are going to be very, very disappointed. However, John Bercow has to represent them. And over here, Vicky Foxcroft is the MP for all those people who voted Green and Lib and da-da-da-da-da-da. So it doesn't matter who you voted for, Vicky there is your MP, for better or for worse. Now, as I said, these are somewhat atypical in that both MPs here were returned with whopping great majorities. What's more typical is that it's a lot closer, although it doesn't necessarily need to be as close as this. Now, this was the smallest margin of victory last year, or sorry, in 2015, earlier this year. And you can see there that it's a whopping victory of 27. That is not a typo. 27 votes separated Byron here from Liz. Now, the thing is, whether it's a majority of 20,000 or 3,000, it doesn't matter. Byron here represents all of these guys, and in fact, they are essentially out of the picture. So it doesn't matter whether you voted for Colin, Darren, Mike, Julia, Baron, Barnes, Von Claptrap, or Steve Roberts, or Mark Evans, Byron Davis is your MP, and he is returned for the Gower Peninsula to represent their interests in Parliament. So this was the overall picture then in 2015. And there's so much here that we're going to have to spend an awful lot of time working on it. You'll have noticed a lot of these things as we were going through it. I think if I were trying to identify some real highlights, the key features here really for me are the distribution of votes and seats with UKIP, SNP and the DUP. Now obviously there are very, very good reasons, well no, they're not actually good reasons, but there's a very clear explanation as to why we have this absurd disparity of seats. We can see here that UKIP got just under 4 million votes, for which they got 1 seat. Whereas down here, if we look at the DUP, 180,000 votes got them 8. And 1.5 million votes there gets 56 for the SNP. These are anomalies that our system throws up. And we will look into them in more detail. Right now, just think about why that might be the case, and we'll discuss those more in class. This is what the map of the UK looks like now. As I said, absolutely solid SNP up here. We've got a couple of anomalies there. Really interesting, I think, here, the pattern, the Labour vote across the shires here is just completely wiped out. And even in some of the inner cities, we've seen a massive erosion of the Labour vote. But we're not really interested in that right now. Really, what we're interested in is just how it generally works. And we can see that over here, the Conservatives just crept over the halfway point to give them an absolute majority in the House of Commons. Certainly not an absolute majority in terms of votes there, and we can see again a massive disparity in that distribution and this distribution down here, and that is a major anomaly in our system. And a lot of the alternative systems we're going to look at are essentially ways of trying to deal with that and rectify these problems. This was the situation in 2010, a different situation altogether. Here we can see this is the halfway point here. This is the absolute majority, and clearly the Conservatives did not make that, and so they had to team up with the Lib Dems in order to try to generate a bloc that would give them control of the House of Commons and thereby a majority, a working majority. And of course, this gave us the coalition for better or worse. Now, of course, Labour could have tried to build a coalition with the Lib Dems, but right now Labour is about as popular as a poisonous snake in the lift, and there was no way that the Lib Dems were going to team up with them. And so instead, we had the Conservative Lib Dem coalition even, and that carried us through from 2010 to 2015. A little bit of historical detail here. Again, a whopping great majority here for Labour. 66 in the grand scheme of things is big. However, it's not big in the grand scheme of Labour. In 2001, they had a huge majority, a majority of 167. But you will know from your research that that was off the back of about 9 million votes, which is extraordinary. Never have we seen such a disparity between votes and majority. And the key number here is down there. It's that less than 60%. That is the lowest turnout for a long time, in fact, possibly ever. Still that massive majority, as I said. This is 1974, and this was the first election in 1974, and you can see here that Labour did not achieve an absolute majority. An absolute majority there would have been, what, 318, so they were well short. As it was, they stumbled on for a few months until they eventually carried on and until they eventually had another election. The significant thing here, I suppose, is this: a huge turnout, worth noting, and again a wafer-thin majority, 318 being the precursor there. As it was, this government was able to struggle on until 1979, when it was no, hang on. I'll have to double check that. I'm not sure it was actually. Well, I'll double check. In fact, you've got the figures, so you can correct me. Right. Now, as I said, this is the Westminster electoral system. It's first past the post system. We call it a plurality system because whoever wins the most votes wins. Doesn't matter whether they win by 1, 2,000 or 20,000. If you win the most votes, you are returned. So here we go again. This is the detail, the overview going back to 2001. You can see there the way in which the turnout has steadily increased. But really what I want you to look at is to try to see if you can find any patterns here. And if you can, well done, because there is no pattern. And this is one of the major problems that we've got with our system. Anyway, before we get on to that sort of analysis, let's talk a little bit more about the mechanics. Country divided into 650 constituencies, about 46 million voters, as we said, 70,000 each constituency. Each party puts forward one candidate. Whoever wins the most votes has the right to represent that constituency. Remember, there was a 27 majority in Gower, and this is called that plurality system. And the winning candidate is returned to a seat in Westminster, and they become the MP for that constituency. Hurrah! The benefits of this system: there's a clear link between the representative and the constituency. If we go back and look at those statistics from Deptford and from excuse me, from Buckingham and indeed from Gower, very, very different results. 20,000 votes, 2,000 votes, whatever it is, 27 votes, doesn't matter. There is one representative. There is absolutely no doubt as to who that representative is. If you have a problem, you take it to them. You don't need to worry about whether or not that guy's going to represent you. So there's one member for all. It usually delivers a government with a strong working majority. We've only had a couple of anomalies in that in recent memory. And it's relatively simple to understand. Even if the outcome is very, very hard to understand, the actual process itself is very simple, and so we have very few spoiled or rejected ballots. It also tends to make it very, very difficult for the lunatic fringe to get a real toehold, and we'll talk about the reasons for that in class. It's disproportionate, however. The result does not accurately reflect the general will, and, well, I don't need to spell that out for you, but 66%, there we go. It's clear that the outcome does not reflect the input, and there's something unsatisfactory about that. The overall winner is not supported by the majority, and again, we can see that here. We have got the majority of the people voting against the Conservatives, and yet they're returned with a majority in the House of Commons. It leads to safe seats. People become disillusioned. They realise that they can't actually change it, and as a result of which, we lead to tactical voting and devalued choice, and also apathy. Again, we'll explore that in class. Finally, it's inconsistent and therefore confusing. And we can see that here. We've got 9% here, which gives us 8% of the vote. We've got 8% of the vote, which gives us 1% of the vote. How on earth does that work? And again, look at the disparity here in these Labour figures, 30 to 29, 36 to 40, but perhaps most striking, I suppose, is the way in which we can go from 32% there to 37%, 51. I mean, the anomalies are evident everywhere we look. There is no pattern, and it's very, very hard to see how the input is reflected in the output. Duverger's law says that it tends to lead to a two-party state, and that's kind of related to that. And again, we can see here it's very, very difficult for smaller parties to break through. Now, I am nearly out of time, so all that remains is that there are these alternative systems. We have proportional systems that are designed to tackle the problems of proportionality, and we have majoritarian systems that are designed to deliver a system that is supported by a majority of voters. Gosh, you should have lots of questions. I really look forward to answering them, and I'll see you in class.